This is the Common Sense Tavern.
What the CPS are doing is they're using public order acts as proxies for blasphemy law.
Today's guest is the wonderful Rafe Heydel-Mankoo.
Second and third generation Muslims in Europe are far more radicalized than their parents or their grandparents.
I think one of the most preeminent thinkers on culture and society in the United Kingdom.
Then you had critical race theory, genderqueer theory, post-colonial theory, and if you link those all together with intersectionality, that's a very potent force for overthrowing the West.
This is the best pub in England.
What will it take for the British people to actually take action on this?
Well, cheers. Hello, Rafe. Welcome to the Common Sense Tavern.
A pleasure.
Anyone
Great.
better to... Are you one of those people who, when you cheers, you have to look in their eyes? Is it just...
No, I refuse to look into people's eyes, actually. I'm just annoyed that I look like some woke hipster here, because I've got this very modern painted glass here, and you've got one of my favourite traditional beer-drinking vessels.
Yeah, a proper mug. That's nice, that. I've only recently got into beer. Right, so let us begin. Blasphemy laws. The man who burnt the Quran. Not a wise thing to do, some might say. But certainly, in my mind, not deserving of any sort of prosecution, particularly when the person who then came out saying he's burning the Quran and tried to attack him, or did physically attack him, nothing's happened to him. What's going on?
Well, I mean, we have to admit now that the British state has actually capitulated to Islamic fundamentalism. It's taken the knee to radical extremists, and we do now have a de facto blasphemy law in this country. And the way it's come about has been so insidious and so sinister, I think everybody needs to take stock, because it goes far beyond just the burning of the Quran, and which of course no one in their right mind would want to naturally outrage people, but it is a right everybody should have. But this is very insidious, because what the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, have done, firstly, they're trying to actually change the law, and they're taking it upon themselves to do the job of Parliament. For example, he was initially charged, this man, with causing alarm and distress to the religious institution of Islam. This great religion of billions of people, perhaps, or millions. This one man had caused alarm and distress to this thing. Now, in English law, it's only a person who can be alarmed and distressed, not an institution. And for the CPS, this is not some junior person who just finished school a few years ago. This is the Crown Prosecution Service. For them to do something which is so clearly nonsensical, and the judge actually called them out on that, shows you the thinking that's going on there. But also now, we have in this country, and we're all waiting for the Islamophobia law to come out from the Labour government. Yeah. But what the CPS are doing is they're using public order acts as proxies for blasphemy law, because this chap was charged under the Public Order Act, and all he did was he burned a Quran outside the Turkish embassy as a protest against the leader of Turkey, who he thinks is making it a hotbed for radical Islam. Turkey, famously a secular state. That was a political protest and his freedom to the right of expression. But because he was attacked by two Muslims, that was the justification, the judge said, of saying that this is why this was so. You're victim blaming, because it caused disorder, because two radicalized people took offense and attacked you.
Right.
Therefore, you are the one who is. Now imagine saying that to a woman who's dressed provocatively and she got raped. Well, of course, or going through a Muslim area of town now, if you are dressed inappropriately and you incite inflame the locals there, are you the one who's guilty? Now, that's essentially what this law says. It's an attack on our freedom of expression, it's an attack on public protest, and of course, it's an attack on property rights. If I buy a book, I have every right to do with that book as I wish.
And I mean, I think this has been done. This is being crafted and curated willfully, deliberately and strategically. I don't know if you saw a report that was leaked to Le Figaro in France And it's a report they've had drawn up about extremism in France, and basically looking a bit like when was it Michael Gove who came out of all the list of the so-called, community leaders and the Muslim organisations that help build community relations and, potentially have links to some pretty hostile states and some dodgy foreign funding. And the same's gone on in France. And this report basically said that, very organised Muslim groups are infiltrating NGOs, schools, universities, creating these organisations to go and teach the police how not to offend the Muslim community, when actually what they're trying to do, inch by inch, is to, start to build up their own sort of book of rights, their own freedoms, and by the back door start taking over our legal system.
Yeah, it's entryism. So we've seen that in 2015 we had a similar report to the Macron report in this country, showing that this is precisely what's happening. It's organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, a deeply disgusting organization founded in the 20s, rife with anti-Semitism. This organization translated Hitler's Mein Kampf and the anti-Semitic protocols of the Elders of Zion into Arabic. They helped to create a Muslim SS brigade in the Balkans, met with Hitler, went to the Nuremberg rallies, and this organization is the one actually that came up with the term Islamophobia in the first place. And the reason it created the term Islamophobia was in order to result in what we see now with the suppression of any criticism of the ideology of Islam, which is very different to anti-Muslim hatred. Of course, any hatred against any individual because of their characteristics is virulent and vile, but no ideology, be it communism, be it Islam, be it Christianity, should be free from criticism. And the creation of this term of Islamophobia by the Muslim Brotherhood, which then Trevor Phillips and the Runnymede Trust here adopted terribly, the entryism now you're seeing through the institutions, and the desire of the British state to avoid interfaith, war, essentially ethnic war in our countries now, because we have population levels to the point that they are. That's all leading to this huge suppression of free speech. I think the French state and the British state understand full well that these countries are tinderboxes waiting to go off. And the only way you can keep the multicultural bandwagon on the road is by silencing the truth tellers and silencing those people.
Going after the native population, basically, and saying, we're going to gaslight you. What you're seeing isn't really happening. It's your fault. You've got prejudice. You're a far-right thug. You're judgmental. If you say or do anything into reaction to this disastrous policy of open-door migration that we've had, and the cultural vandalism that has taken place, you are the problem. You're not allowed to protest. If you do, you'll go to prison. And we see now what is going on in France. Well, obviously the mainstream media in the UK aren't covering it, but night after night now, riots in Paris, eye-wateringly violent, explosive. I think 600 odd people now had to be arrested. A police officer in a coma. Lots of people have been physically attacked. And this is not just Paris, it's cities like Dax as well. And it's pretty much all young North African men who aren't necessarily straight off the boat, but have been there for 2, 3, their parents have been there or their grandparents have been there. But they're going around tearing up cities like Paris with willful abandon. It's terrifying.
Yeah, and of course you need to understand that this is, again, the French people are being gaslit. People are saying, oh, this was just sports fans going and getting out of hand. Well, I'm sorry, when France won the Olympics in 1998, won the World Cup in 98, compare the scenes of peace and harmony that erupted there with what you're seeing right now. And we know full well that, second and third generation Muslims in Europe are far more radicalized than their parents or their grandparents. And we were always told, oh, don't worry, within a generation or two they'll be assimilated. On the contrary, they hold far more abhorrent and radical views than their parents or grandparents. One of the stats I like to throw out in terms of British youth in this, Muslim youth in this country, is 1/3 of British youth aged 16 to 24 in this country believe you should be put to death for apostasy, for leaving the faith. Of course, we know in Paris, 77%, well, as you did on your wonderful documentary that you produced for the New Culture Forum, 77% of rape convictions in Paris are from foreign nationals. We know that Algerians and North Africans in general are by multiples of more than 10 more likely to be involved in sex crimes or rape. These are the stories you can't talk about, and if you do try to talk about them, then of course you are accused of racism just simply for highlighting the facts. We saw that with the same way that the Southport protesters were smeared as far right. And of course, there was the allegation of misinformation because he wasn't an asylum seeker. Well, actually, he was the child of an asylum seeker. And again, first generation, second generation, third generation, we don't pay enough attention to the fact that the children of asylum seekers are deeply disturbed, as disturbed as many of those who come over here. And if you look at recent terror attacks in Britain, a huge number of them are actually the children of asylum seekers. And yet, because this was supposedly a Welsh choir boy, the media smeared everyone as saying, well, there's no connection at all to the immigration crisis in this country. I'm sorry, the big discussion we should be having here is about the fact that people born in this country to migrants suffer from many of the same mental afflictions.
What on earth can we now do about it? Because it seems to me, and I don't know what you think about that, I get the impression the British state know that we live in a powder keg. They know that great harm has been done to the nation, that we're balkanised, that there are people who live in this country, who hate this country, who wish us harm. We saw that during the Southport riots when young Muslim men came out of a mosque with weapons. And the police said, oh, would you mind going and putting your, arsenal back in the mosque? I mean, it's craziness. And I think but we're going to hit something, the next and there will be another terror attack in the UK. We'll be gaslit and told it's not. But the next thing that happens, I don't know what this country is going to become. I don't know what's going to become of France. How do we now reverse
the first
this?
thing is, what will it take for the British people to actually take action on this? After the Manchester Arena bombing, we thought maybe that would do it. No, we were told don't look back in anger. Then Southport happened. The people rose up, the great British people, and they were all slurred as far right, even by Keir Starmer, called criminals by the government before there was even a legal trial.
Yeah.
And now we had the report out showing that there are no far right connections to those political prisoners we have, like Lucy Connolly. Let's admit that we have political prisoners in this country. That's the reality. Now, what amazes me is a country like Ireland has only had mass immigration for a few years. Mind you, they're a very small country of 5 million people, but they've already taken to the streets because they've had a long, hard struggle to get their independence and their sense of identity, and they're very protective of it. In this country, we've always been top dog. We've never really had our freedoms threatened or lost, so we take them for granted. And now we're like the frog in the increasingly boiling water, unaware of the real crisis that's all around us. Now, there's a chap we had on our New Culture Forum called Professor David Betts, who says that Britain is heading towards civil war. But I don't think he doesn't mean the American type of civil war, where it's literally people with guns in the streets attacking each other, but more the sort of sectarian conflict we saw in Northern Ireland, where there was constant attacks between two groups, between the Islamic radicalized fundamentalists and the white identity movement, which is still very much in its infancy. The Islamic extremists have had 25 years, essentially, to get where they are today. They're in phase 2 of what's called the traditional Maoist insurgency. The first stage is, 10, 15 years of propagandizing, getting your victim narrative, trying to convert people to your cause, raising money, often with criminal gangs and so forth, and getting some muscle. And then they're now at stage 2, where essentially they've got people in elected office. They can call upon people like the Muslim Defense League and these guys, and they can do terrorist attacks, take part in mass. They have no-go zones where police have to ask permission from community elders, whether they can visit on certain times and so forth. So they're at stage 2. The white identity movement is tiny in comparison, but I think over the next 10, 20 years, you're going to see them essentially become a rival. And that's when you get to a point, essentially, where you would have the sorts of scenes we saw all too well, unfortunately, in Northern Ireland between the Catholics and Protestants.
Do you think that France, countries like France and Germany, are possibly ahead of us, actually, in this? Because yes, we had the Southport riots. The government, I believe, deliberately curated a situation. I honestly believe this, that, I have suspicions about the nature of those riots. I might sound like a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, but one minute they were just a load of beer-bellied old men lobbing lager cans around. Then all of a sudden they were young, fit and healthy guys all in black with balaclavas. And I'm like, all right, who are these then? These don't seem like your average local. And then, of course, the massive smackdown, the calling everyone a far-right thug, those televised trials, throwing people like Lucy Connolly in prison. To me, it was very deliberate that, right, we need to smack down and get control over this situation now, because when people learn the truth about the Southport slayer, they're going to go tonto. But it seems to me what's going on in France, we're now all too scared to go out and do anything, frankly, or say anything, because we know what could happen to us. But in France, it is out of control there at the moment. Night after night of the city up in flames. Obviously, we're not talking about it over here. It's the same, like you said, in Ireland. I think there are other countries, and Sweden, for crying out loud. I mean, there's probably other countries in Europe that are even closer to disaster.
Yes, well, of course, the French also have a history of violence and revolting, so it's much more part of that culture. Interestingly, I think one of the reasons you do have this pushback in France is because the French are very, very strong in promoting secularism, very strongly, banning the burqa, banning bikinis on beaches and so forth, whereas in this country we simply are too tolerant and we allow, so there's no need to riot so much here because they get everything that they want to get, essentially, is what you have. And if you look at, so for example, polling done by Policy Exchange shows that 81% of British Muslims identify as being British first, being Muslim first and British second. It's half that in France. It's only 46% in France. So more Muslims in France identify as being French, I think, because of that assertive promotion of French values, but that seems to be a red rag to the bull to those more extreme elements within French society. Look, Sweden, undoubtedly, rape capital of Europe, terrorist bombing attack capital of Europe. But they've now got the Swedish Democrats there. They've got a good government in, and they've managed to, for the first time in, I think, since the war, have negative net immigration. More people leaving than coming because of a raft of draconian policies, which we should be embracing in this country.
Well, let's talk about these.
So, well, obviously you need to have mass deportations of illegal immigrants. Anyone with a conviction who's a dual citizen should be deported from the country. But also they've embraced, and the Dutch and the Danes and the Finns and the Hungarians are also considering voluntary remigration. So if you are a naturalized citizen, for example, you'll be encouraged to leave and you'll be paid 300,000 krona, which is around £25,000 to leave the country. If you're a family of 4 or 5, you can have a very good life if you go back to Eritrea or Somalia or wherever you're coming from. And of course, some people say, well, why should we be paying people at all? Well, of course, we know that in this country, for example, only 1 in 20 migrants is a high-skilled net contributor. 16% of them are skilled workers, but even the majority of skilled workers are low-wage earners. I don't think people realize that. Only 0.6% of immigrants are scientists and engineers, only 0.8% are doctors, right? So from the moment they set foot on British soil, most migrants to this country in recent years are a net drain on the economy. They on average cost £151,000 by the time they get to retirement age. By the time they get to 81, if they live that long, each one will have cost us £465,000 each. So an initial outlay of, say, £20,000 to encourage them to return on the condition that they renounce their citizenship and don't come back, I think makes sound economic sense, let alone cultural sense. And of course, we need to have an assertive and aggressive promotion of British culture, British pride in Britain, rather than prioritising minority cultures.
We can take a leaf, actually, out of many Muslim countries' books, ironically, because it tends to be Muslim countries who say we're going to ban the burqa, we're going to prescribe the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, which are considered a terrorist organisation in much of the Middle East. And the way that they have actually, because they live with this beast, it's interesting when you see people from that region say, Britain, you're messing this up. We know the dark side of Islam. It's existed in our country, and this is what we've done to control it, and you're rolling over on it all. It's crazy.
Well, and you have leading figures in the UAE and in the Gulf states saying that there are more terrorists in Britain than there are in our country. There are more extremists. It's a little amazed at what's happening. You even have the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, in passing draconian laws to try to suppress Wahhabi extremism in that country, whilst we, of course, are going just the other way. And of course, if the Labour government comes out now with this new Islamophobia blasphemy law, it's going to have such a chilling effect on free speech. Firstly, Islamophobia is a nonsense term. As I said, it was deliberately created in order to suppress criticism of Islam. But the Labour Party is convinced that Islamophobia is racist because most Muslims are non-white. Now, most Catholics are non-white. If I attack the Pope, I'm not being racist, right? Most communists in the world are Chinese. It's not racist to attack communism. And then Sunni and Shia hate each other. Are they being Islamophobic? If they regard the other ones, it's such a nonsensical term. Anti-Muslim hatred, sure, always should be illegal, but no ideology should be free from criticism. But what this new blasphemy law will do when it comes in, anyone who tries to criticize polygamy, child marriage, cousin marriage, anyone who maybe even the rape gangs, that could all be considered Islamophobic, because this loose definition that they're currently working with, the all-party parliamentary group, discusses Muslimness or perceived Muslimness.
It's a disaster. Why is there such a weird, sick relationship between the far left and Islam? We've seen this in France, basically. It's Jean-Luc Mélenchon over there, who's the sort of far leftist, who's, again, pushing for things like Islamophobia. We've got the cultural Marxists in the UK and across the West trying to destroy and denigrate our history. And they always team up. They always team up with the Muslims. This has happened throughout history. Like you said about Hitler in the Second World War, who in my mind, Hitler was far left, not far right. But what is that relationship all about? Why do it's
the red-green alliance, as it's sometimes called, and you have two ideologies there, both of which dream of a utopia. One is ultimately communist, one of which is Islamic. But to get to that utopia, you have to have a reign of terror. You have to suppress freedoms, and they are linked by authoritarianism and the support of authoritarianism. And what brings them together is a visceral hatred and loathing of the West, of Western civilization, what it stands for, what it achieves. For Islam, it's been over 1,000-year history of a clash of civilizations with Christendom. And with the far left, of course, it's a hatred of capitalism, it's a hatred of hierarchy and everything actually that made Britain and the West the great success globally. But anyone on the left who thinks that they can ally with Islam and get off scot-free just have to look to Iran, where, of course, we saw the students in Iran under the Shah allying with the Ayatollah. As soon as you had the Iranian Revolution in 1979, they were strung up with piano wire. I mean, and so your Turkey's voting for Christmas if you think that allying with Islam is the way to go. But you have to remember, of course, one of the reasons why we have the rise of woke culture and the promotion of minorities is because the far left realized after the Russian Revolution that the traditional proletariat, the workers in the factories and so forth, were small c conservative patriots. They aren't going to be the foot soldiers of a revolution. That's what, of course, what we saw with the Red Wall voting for Brexit, voting for Nigel Farage and reform. What we've seen in America with the blue-collar workers voting for Trump. The communists didn't expect those people to actually be on the side of conservatism and tradition. And so minorities then became the new foot soldiers. And so what the far left did in the 20th century, and you had the rise of critical race theory and other theories, was to get new forms of Marxism. So you had radical feminism was an attack on masculinity. Well, let me say, so traditional Marxism was all about the oppressor and the oppressed, proletariat and the bourgeoisie. But then you got radical feminism, which was an attack on men, but also upon masculinity, which of course created Western civilization. Then you had critical race theory, which was an attack on whiteness, and that's where Islam comes into play. And then you had gender-queer theory, which is an attack on the family. Then you had post-colonial theory, which was an attack on all of the heritage and history and culture of Western civilization. And if you link those all together with intersectionality, that's a very potent force for overthrowing the West. And Islam is just one of the ways in which you can destabilize our society.
It's like two bullies in a playground, isn't it? Sort of teaming up, because that's the way I often see the left. Their visceral hatred is against people that they wish they were, or people that they don't feel like they belong to. They can't have it. They're not straight. They're not, men. They're not, whatever it may be. They've been bullied at school. They feel marginalized, and they like to beat up anybody they think is above them and wrap their arms around anyone who they see as a fellow victim. But, I mean, let's talk about Reform UK, because there's been a lot of criticism that Reform UK is not really grabbing the nettle on stuff like this, that there's a bit of lily-liveredness going on, that everyone's looking for a leader in this, even moderate people up and down the country who have never really sort of, thought of voting in the direction of reform before, kind of now need their vanguard in this debate. Reform have done a few things, after the local elections, they're doging local authorities. Let's see how that goes. And of course, they're sort of, taking down all the woke flags from council buildings that they now control. And are saying they're going to create, or have created, a sort of star chamber of legal eagles to push back against the creation of migrant hotels, etc. It's potentially a good first step, but it's not going to go far enough, is it?
No, look, I am a big supporter of what Reform is doing. I think we're at a critical moment in our history. This is once in 100 years where the tectonic plates shift. And 100 years ago, the Labour Party took over from the Liberal Party, and we could be at the point now where Reform takes over from the Conservative Party. So I think we have to get behind it, because this is the only chance we're going to have to disrupt the establishment. So I don't want to criticise it too heavily, but I do think it could go further than it is going on a lot of these issues. What you have to remember, of course, and what the Westminster bubble doesn't realise, is that the average British voter is to the right of the average Conservative MP on immigration. Right? So the entire political class is far more left on immigration than the British voter is. And I'm not sure whether Reform fully understands, actually, that the public are willing for them to go a lot further than perhaps they might think they're doing. Having said that, clearly what Reform is doing is working, because it's storming ahead in the polls. Yeah. So it's a recipe, their policies are a recipe for success. The question is, you can't alienate your core people who are the ones who really want you to get a firm grip on all of this. But I think the people of this country aren't blind. They can see what's going on. They know what's going on. Part of me wonders whether actually Reform is trying to do what perhaps Tony Blair did. Tony Blair didn't say too much about his radical agenda until he got into power.
Almost sort of right-wing to Keir, to use a Muslim word, he sort of disguised your true intentions.
It's not the best. I'm not advocating it as a policy, but I got that sort of as a hope. That
all political parties do this, They say things that are politically expedient before an election, and then when they've got into office, then they go, right, this is what we're actually going to do. That is the game. And I think with Reform, Nigel's learnt the hard way for 20 years that the establishment media are going to call him a racist, they're going to call him a xenophobe, they're going to call him dangerous. He's seen what's happened around the West. He's seen what they've done to Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders, Viktor Orban, all these people, Giorgia Meloni, denigrated for being monsters. And he doesn't want to give them the opportunity to do that. But what I would say is, well, look, they did it to Orban, they did it to Meloni, it did it to Trump. Hasn't stopped them actually getting into power. People see through this stuff.
But Reform is coming on side in many ways. For example, you may remember a few months ago he did an interview on another channel, and he ruled out mass deportations, and it was impossible.
Yeah.
Few months later, changed his story on that, particularly after Trump sort of came out in support of mass deportation and so forth. Again, the words on the migrant hotels. Now, I said for a long time, you need to empty all the migrant hotels, build temporary refugee camps in Scotland and elsewhere, make Britain less attractive than France. And Reform is now saying something along those lines. So I think what Reform is doing is coming up with sensible policies, but it's not necessarily trying to get those red top headlines.
It's sort of feeling around, it's pushing, testing boundaries, it's seeing what it can get away with, what the public, it's looking at polling, it's inching its way to where it wants to be. Because I know everyone in Reform, I know where they want to be, I'm certain of it. But I think they're sort of, taking a very cautious approach. They don't want to give the mainstream media the opportunity to turn around and go, these people are a load of Fruit Loops, nutters, racists, and are dangerous. Because a lot of people out there, you and I are very conversant on politics. We probably know everything that every politician says on a daily basis. Most people out there could only name Sir Keir Starmer and Nigel Farage as politicians and pick up a lot of their information from vibes. And so when the narrative is constantly put out there that someone's dangerous, someone's wicked, it actually does have an effect. There are a load of people out there who will think, well, they must be then, so I can't vote for them.
You're absolutely right. That's exactly what's happening. People, and of course, anyone who watches your show, they're also very politically aware, but people have to realise, of course, the great British population don't have that same level of knowledge.
The great British population don't all listen to my show.
And that's because,
no, you're right.
But the amazing thing is, for example, there are only 20 million Twitter accounts in the UK, and only a tiny number of those are politically engaged, or only a fraction are politically engaged. So the majority of the public of this country still watch the legacy media, where the news is curated by left-wing editors, And so all of these discussions that we have, they pass them by completely.
Well, they don't watch news at all.
Well, they don't watch news at all.
I mean, my own darling brother, you know, who always says to me, I don't like watching you on TV because I want to be your brother. I don't want to get involved with your politics or talk about your show. When I see you, we're brother and sister and we prat about and do brother and sister things. So therefore, I don't watch you on TV. And I'm sure if I said to Jonathan, what did you make of the whole fallout about Rupert Lowe? He'd be like, Rupert who? You know, he's not going to know. And that's, I think, where most people are at in the UK.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's the reality. Only Nigel Farage has the recognition that could have had. Remember, we tried with UKIP, we tried with the Brexit Party, but nothing has come close to fundamentally re-altering British politics than where reform is right now.
I tell you what's funny, when you see, I was looking at Rachel Reeves doing a speech and then to Keir Starmer the other day, when he did his whole bloody press conference about Nigel, I'm like, dude, that was not a good idea. But you can see they're using those sort of ghost auto cues with the way they sort of talk like that, talking here. They're very good, those auto cues, because it looks like you're addressing a crowd when you're reading. But they can't talk. And when you look at someone like Nigel Farage, who's, you know, he won the battle against the banks. He won the battle against the entirety of the EU, for crying out loud. And you look at the way he just communicates very clearly. The other day in Scotland, when he called out at that press conference, the fact that the journalists had probably leaked to leftist activists locations that were only given to a certain number of journalists to create riots and protests. And he'll just say it straightforwardly. And I look at him, I mean, obviously I'm biased, he's one of my bezzers, but I look at him and I look at all the other dross we've got right now in Parliament and I go, there's a leader. That's someone who would be able to get on the phone to Russia and say, Putin, stop effing around, or no, we're not going to do this, this is what Britain's going to do. It's the only politician we've got in this country.
Yeah.
I can't see another politician at all anywhere.
Well, the most consequential politician since Margaret Thatcher, I would say, at least for good. And for damage, we can look at Blair. Now, look, this is not to give unadulterated praise to Nigel. I think Nigel is fantastic. I think we have to get behind him because we need to fundamentally kill off the Tory party. I think the Tory party needs to die. We need to have a hostile takeover by reform of the Tory party as well and subsume it. No pacts, but just take the party.
Take the good ones.
Take the party over. Yeah, that's what happened in Canada in '93 when the Progressive Conservative Party went from being the majority government. It went down to having only 2 seats in Parliament. The biggest party on the right in the Canadian Parliament was the Reform Party of Canada, and they then basically swallowed up the Progressive Conservative Party. There's an oxymoron in the name. And a new Conservative Party was born. That's what I think reform needs to do. But you know, you can also criticise Nigel Farage as well, but I think anybody who wants meaningful change needs to understand this is the vehicle by which it's achieved, and if they do get into power, then we can hopefully apply pressure and influence to pursue the policies we all want to pursue. So whether you're pro or anti-Nigel, you need to understand there's a greater issue at stake here. And I wish Nigel well. I also hope that he can get around him a great team, because it's one thing to be a party of protest and of campaigning, but if you want to be seen as a viable alternative to the Labour Party in government, you need to, of course, have the makings at least of a core element of a shadow cabinet.
Now, before I let you go, I know pubs are supposed to be a nice, relaxing time where you just chew the cud and say what you think, but I like to challenge people a little bit. So I want you to try and explain to me, not 60 seconds, that's no realistic amount of time, but what would be your one policy to save Britain?
All right. So, very easy. You cannot win the battle for Britain and the war on woke if you don't first win the battle for young minds. We have the most radicalised left-wing youth in history. Across a whole slew of policy issues, they have views that are out of kilter with every other dynamic and every other group. What that means is within the next 20 or 30 years, we could have a generation of people running this country who not only are ignorant of our history and our culture, but actually despise it. And the way you do that is, you can change the curriculum as much as you want to, but you need to fundamentally change teacher training, because the teachers are the most left-wing ever, and the rise of left-wing youth matches the rise of left-wing teachers. Teacher training colleges, or I call them woke madrasas, we need to completely close down university departments of education, restore the old independent teacher training colleges we used to have, back before in 30, 40 years ago, where you had right and left-wing teachers in schools. Now we just have 90% of teachers are left-wing. And, forget university, it's when children are young that they are actually most introduced firstly to these woke concepts. As Aristotle said, show me a boy of 7 and I will show you the man. That's when the attitudes, I always say, if the hair is blue, there's nothing you can do. Don't go after the university kids, it's school children, change the curriculum, and that's the only hope we're going to have of producing a generation of kids who are once again proud to be British.
Would you close faith schools?
No, I wouldn't close faith schools, but I would ensure that faith schools are actually... I'm a product of a Catholic school education myself, which I think is very important, but I would make sure that we knew what's going on in those schools. And I think a lot of the problems in terms of Orthodox Jewish schools and a lot of Islamic schools is we don't actually know what's happening within them.
My view is this, I don't know why we've got this idea in the UK that everyone's got to be treated as equal, that, well, if you're going to have a Church of England school and a Catholic school, you have to be able to have a Muslim school. I'm like, no, that's not the rule. You can have a Church of England school and a Catholic school and say those are the only faith schools you're allowed. Everything else can be a non-faith school. I don't know why we feel the need to sort of, try and make it a constantly a level playing field when we've got our own indigenous culture and a religion upon which we've been built.
Good point, yeah.
Anyway, there you go, Rafe. It's been brilliant talking to you. I've made you speak so much, you've not been able to get your chops around that woke beer.
Well, here we go.
Cheers,
Great to see you. All the best.
Great to see you.